Good morning, everybody. Welcome to our Sunday morning service. Listen, we're so glad that you decided to tune in with us today. We're going to ask that before we get started, that you would please like and share this video broadcast with your friends and neighbors. If you could please hit the like button as well as hitting the share button, we would greatly appreciate it. Especially if you're on YouTube, make sure that you hit the like button on YouTube, because we've discovered that the more likes or the thumbs up rather, the more you hit that on YouTube, it actually, what YouTube does according to their algorithm, it expands the broadcast to other places and other areas that it would not normally go if the likes weren't there. So we're not asking you every week to like it just to get the likes. We're actually asking you to like it so that we can get the reach that we're wanting to be able to do. So if you could please accommodate us in that, we would be so grateful to you. Likewise, we are continuing with our series on choices. And if you know people who are prone to making bad choices, who have a history of making some bad choices, we are learning how to make choices. And I'm going to ask that you would tag them in this video so that they can participate with us. And so while we're doing that, I'm going to ask that you would also join me in a word of prayer that we may get started. Our God in heaven, we thank you for blessing us to be here this morning. We thank you, Lord, for allowing us to see another day. We thank you, Lord, that you have taken the time to stop by each of our homes and to wake us up and allow us the movement of our limbs and the soundness of our minds. God, I pray over each household that is listening. And I'm asking, Lord, that you would give peace to that home. I'm asking, Lord, that you would remove all of the distractions, that you would quiet everything around us, that we may hear what it is you want to say. God, speak now that we may be able to hear you, and open our minds and our ears that we may receive what you want to say. Change us from the inside out so that we are never the same. In the mighty name of Jesus, we ask it and we pray. And everyone say it, amen. All right, so once again, we are continuing in our series on choices. Last week, we talked about the honesty choice. And so last week we learned that we were supposed to ask the question, am I being honest to myself? For real though. And so we're coming through this series, and God has been blessing us the last few weeks as we have made our way through this. And I'm going to ask that you would please pray with me as we make our way through this week. This week, I want to talk about the legacy question, okay? The legacy question. Now, what we've learned in the first week is this, is that all of us struggle at times with making proper choices. What we also learned is that being able to make proper or better choices is often tied to the questions that we ask or don't know to ask. And so we learned that there's a relationship between asking the right questions and making the right choices, because when we make the right choices, we end up with more favorable outcomes. And when we make the wrong choices, we end up with less favorable outcomes. And so, and because there's a relationship between choices and questions, what I said was I'm going to give us at least 5, it may even be 6 by the time I'm finished, but I'm going to give us at least 5 questions that we should ask in almost any scenario. And as we begin to employ these questions and utilize them and ask them in almost any scenario, what God is going to do is he's going to give us immense clarity in terms of the directionality that we should take in whatever situation we find ourselves in. And so this week, we're talking about the legacy question. So I have 3 questions for you. First question. What are some things that you have done in life that you hope God allows you to take to the grave? Question number 2. When you die, what do you want to be said about you? Question number 3. Are you satisfied with the current story of your life representing you for all eternity? You see, these questions are sobering questions. But they're sobering questions because what they get at is they get at our legacy, right? These questions get at the part of us that wants to be seen in the best light. And so the question becomes, right, when you think about it, when you think about your life, just think about it for a moment. Are you satisfied, right? When you think about your life, when you think about the decisions that you've made, when you think about the things that you have given yourself and your time to, are you satisfied with the story of your life, the real story, the story that's going to be told? Are you satisfied with that story being the representative of who you are for the rest of eternity? See, and the problem is many of us, we don't think about our lives that way. We don't think of our lives as a story being told. But the reality is, and the problem with many of us is we see our lives as a series of events. And because we see our lives as a series of events, what we see is us dealing with things as events take place. Most often what we don't do is we don't see our lives as a story that's actually being written. And so in order for life to really become effective, in order for it to push us to make better choices, we're going to have to change how we see our lives. And we have to change from seeing our lives as an event to seeing our lives as a story that's actually being written. And so we actually have to begin to learn how to look at our lives from the end of our lives rather than from the middle. Because if we look at our lives from the end of our lives, it shines a greater light on what kind of life we actually want to be known for. And the reality is the Bible actually warns us about our stories. It does it in several places, but I want to call out one place to you in a way in which this is a scripture that we often overlook. Watch what it says. Romans chapter 14 on your handout says this, verse 1, accept him whose faith is weak without passing judgment on disputable matters. One man's faith allows him to eat everything, but another man whose faith is weak eats only vegetables. The man who eats everything must not look down on him who does not, and the man who does not eat everything must not condemn the man who does, for God has accepted him. Who are you to judge someone else's servant? To his own master he stands or falls, and he will stand, for the Lord is able to make him stand. One man considers one day more sacred than another. Another man considers every day alike. Each one should be fully convinced in his own mind. He who regards one day as special does so to the Lord. He who eats meat eats to the Lord, for he gives thanks to God. And he who abstains does so to the Lord, and he gives thanks to God. For none of us lives to himself alone, and none of us dies to himself alone. If we live, we live to the Lord, and if we die, we die to the Lord. So whether we live or die, we belong to the Lord. For this very reason, Christ died and returned to life so that he might be the Lord of both the dead and the living. You then, why do you judge your brother? Or why do you look down on your brother? For we will all stand before God's judgment seat. Verse 11. It is written, as surely as I live, says the Lord, every knee will bow before me, every tongue will confess to God. Verse 12, don't let this pass you by. So then, each of us will give an account of himself to God. Did you get that? Watch this. This passage in Romans 14 is packed with a lot of cultural stuff that many of us aren't privy to in terms of what they were dealing with. But pretty much, if I could sum it up in a nutshell, what was happening is that the believers were judging each other on how they lived out their Christianity on matters that didn't really matter. That's really what was going on. And so you had some people, it says in the text, who considers one day greater than another day. And then you have someone else who considers every day the same, right? It's just like with many of us who are Christians. Some of us regard Sunday as the holy day. For others of us, Sunday isn't the holy day. Every day, we would say, is the holy day. And so the one who regards one day greater than the other should not look down on the one who regards every day the same. And the one who regards every day the same shouldn't look down on the one who regards one day higher than another. And so they were judging each other based upon how they were living out their Christian lives according to their cultural norms. And Paul warns us, listen carefully, Paul warns us about paying too much attention to somebody else's story, right? Because that's why they were judging each other. They were paying too much attention to the other person's story. And he warns us about spending time judging someone else. Why? Because we need to pay attention to our own story. Our own story needs attention because we are going, he says in the last verse, we are going to have to give an account to God one day. Now, he says this in verse 12. So then each of us will give an account of himself to God. This word account is an interesting word because it is the word logos, but it comes with the meaning of a word, a speech, a sermon, an explanation, a dissertation, if you will. In other words, and I don't know how this is going to happen, but one day the text says all of us are going to stand before God. And when we stand before God, watch this, our stories are going to be completely revealed at that point. And when our stories, the story of our life is completely revealed at that point, Paul says we're going to have to give a word, a speech, a sermon, an explanation, a dissertation about our story. God is going to call us into question about the choices and the decisions that we made that make up the story of our lives. And when we stand before God, we're going to have to give an account for the decisions that we've made, for the places that we've been, for the things that we've done. And it's going to be bigger than what we show everybody else, because not only are all of our actions going to be on display, but the motivation behind the actions are going to be on display. So the things that I have done that made you think that I was a good person and I was able to walk away from the interaction because I'm comfortable that you thought good about me because that's how I presented it. When that story plays out before God, the action will be there, but the motivation to the action will be behind it, and the real story will actually be revealed. And so Paul says, like, don't get carried away paying attention to other people's stories. Like, take some time and pay attention to your own story. Why? Because one day, you and me, we both are going to have to give an account for our own stories. And now when he says don't judge, and I want to make this clear, when he says don't judge or why do you judge, he's not telling us to not judge in every sense of the word, not judge. Judging actually has a couple of different nuances to it. And so he's not saying don't judge like completely. And you know he's not saying that because Matter of fact, look at Matthew chapter 18, verse 15. It says this: if your brother sins against you, go and show him his fault just between the two of you. If he listens, you have won your brother over. So Matthew says, if your brother sins against you, go show him his fault. How can you even determine that someone has sinned against you unless you make a judgment? You understand what I mean? So he's not saying don't make any judgments, but there's a way that we should not be judging. And so judging has a couple of nuances to it. And so here's the first nuance. The first nuance of judging is it's about passing a binding ordinance or law. Okay. Now, he's not talking about that, but that's one aspect of judging, which has to do with passing a binding ordinance or a law. Number two, the second nuance of judging is determining the truth of something. Right? And that's the sense in which we are to judge. We are to make judgments about each other in the sense that what we're looking for is the truth of something. Now, there's a third sense or third nuance of judging that Paul warns us to stay away from. And it is in this sense that Paul warns us in Romans 14. And the third sense is this: it is making a determination that causes us to look down upon someone else, right? And the reason why we would look down upon someone else is because we have classified them in our heart as less or lower and have classified ourselves as greater or better, right? And so Paul says, like, don't do that. Now, how do you know that's what Paul is saying? Because look at verse 10. You then, why do you judge your brother? Or why do you, underline, look down on your brother? For we will all stand before God's judgment seat. So what Paul is saying is that we should not judge each other in the sense that I look down upon you or you look down upon me. I don't have time to classify myself as greater than you, because I need to pay more attention to my own story, because one day, just as you're going to have to give an account, so am I. And therefore, in that way, Paul says we should not judge each other. We should pay attention to our own stories. See? Because one day, all of our stories are going to be revealed. And here's the question. When your story is revealed, when my story is revealed, here's the question. The question is this: what story do you want to tell? See? That's the legacy question. The legacy question is this: what story do you want to tell? As I said before, oftentimes when we look at life, we see life as a series of events. We see what we deal with and what we go through as a series of events. And what I'm suggesting is that life is much more than a series of events. Life is actually a story that is being written one choice at a time. And the question becomes, if life is a story that's being written one choice at a time, the question is, what story do you want to tell? See, and I've learned this about stories, right? It's interesting about stories. Number one, we all want to tell the story that favors us. Right? We do. We all want to tell the story that I don't even know everybody that's listening right now. But here's what I do know about you. What I know about you is you want to tell the story that favors you. And here's what I know about you. Whenever you tell a story, you tell a story in such a way where you're the hero. Right? Most often, I'm serious. Most often, what we do is we tell stories that tend to favor us, right? And even, watch this, even when we tell stories where we're the villain, we are the best villain in the version of the story we tell. Last week, I told a story about some donuts. Right? And I told a story about how I knew I wasn't supposed to have a donut. So I'm driving down 23rd and I see Andy's Donuts and I go in there and I did the whole thing about the salesman in my head. My salesman talked me into going in, getting the donut. And I told the story about how I got the donut, ate the donut, right? And so I told on myself. And then Miss Savannah, bless her heart, she made a post, and her post, there was like this little meme thing. And there was a post and she said, I have so many more questions about the donut story, because inside of the little meme thing, it was like written in Old English or something. And it said, for no one eateth just one donut, right? And she's right, because the way I told the story, and I was the villain, but I was the best villain, because I told the story in such a way where I went and got one donut. But here's the truth. I actually went and bought 3. Right? That's the truth. I actually bought 3 donuts and I ate 1.5 that day. And then the next morning I ate the other half of the one that I didn't finish from the day prior. And then somebody else at the house, I think my son, he ate the 3rd donut. So that's the truth actually of what happened. But when I told the story, right, even though I was the villain and I was going to tell on myself, listen, I'm telling you, and here's why I'm telling you, because what I want you guys to understand is this is not something that I'm saying to you that I have mastered. No. The tendency for me too is to tell the story in a way that favors me. Right? Even if I'm the villain, I want to be the best villain in the story. Right? And so I tend to tell the stories that way. But so do you. When you tell stories where you are most likely the hero of the story. Because all of us want to tell stories that favors who we are. And so number 2 on your handout, our tendency is to live the story one way and to tell it a different way. That's our tendency. We tend to live the story one way, but we tell the story a different way. Why? Why do we do that? Right? Why do we do that? The reason why we do that is it's a little obscure answer, but you'll see what I mean in a minute. The reason why we do that is because of emotions. Right? Let that sink in. The reason why we do it is because of emotions. See? What do you mean by emotions? Because many of us have made choices based on emotional highs that haven't always served us well. We've made choices. And high emotions, listen to me carefully, high emotions complicate choices. And because sometimes we have given ourselves over to high emotions and we have made decisions when we were highly emotional, we have made decisions that did not favor us well. And because those decisions didn't favor us well, because we were in our feelings, either positive or negative, right? A, on your handout, we tend to tell the story, listen carefully, the way we want it to be as opposed to the way it actually is, right? All because of emotions, because we're on an emotional high. And get this, isn't this true that some of the worst decisions that you've ever made in life were decisions that you made because you were emotionally gassed up? Right? Isn't that true? Right? Just think about it. Isn't it true? Some of the worst decisions you made in your life that you made because you were on an emotional high. And I mean either good emotion, right? You was all hyped, or bad emotions where you were just angry and ticked off or whatever. And we make decisions in these high emotional places, right? So when we're all gassed up about something, right? That's what we call it, in the hood. We know, somebody gassed up. When we make decisions from these high emotional places, the tendency is if I'm in a good emotional place and I'm like riding up here, I tend to sign up for things that I haven't thought through. And then if I'm angry, then I tend to make decisions and I tend to cut people and things off before I've had time to think it through. And we have said things that we didn't, that we really didn't mean to say, or we have signed up for things that we really hadn't counted the cost to be responsible for. Like I'm telling you, like I remember being in school. And again, we call this gassed up. I remember being in school and I remember like it would be two dudes who didn't like each other. And there was one dude and they were supposed to fight or whatever. And one dude he didn't have a chance at winning because, the other dude knew how to fight. But this one dude, he didn't have a chance at winning. And kids can be cruel, you know what I mean? And I remember being in school and the kids would go to the one dude who couldn't fight and they'd be over there gassing him up, right? He'd be over, listen, hey, he ain't nothing. You can get him. You can take him. Gassing him up, right? And then they all in his head like, man, listen, I wouldn't let him do that to me. All you got to do is blah, blah, blah. And they talking this dude and gassing him and when he gets near the other dude, right? Listen, this cat, he's so gassed up on this emotion. He walks into something that he has no idea that he has no idea what awaits him, right? But he's on some emotional stuff. So this cat makes a decision on some emotional stuff to go and get into something, and there he go, right? And we all know the outcome. This dude gets whooped 7 days from Sunday is really kind of what happens, because it is not good for us to make decisions on these emotional highs. I remember when I was years ago, I remember when I was wrestling with, was God calling me to do this? Right? Was God calling me to preach? I remember wrestling with that. And here's how I felt. I felt that, and I remember I was sitting in the church, in the sanctuary, in the back row. I used to sit in the back on the left-hand side of the church we were in. And I remember hearing the preacher preach, and different preachers would come and I would listen to them. And every time I would hear the preacher preach, I would take his message and break it down. And then I would reconstruct it in my mind. And then at the end, I would always say, man, he should have said this, or man, he should have put that in there, or man, it would have been hot if he would have did this, that, or the other, blah, blah, blah. Right. And I kind of start lightweight preaching to myself in my head. Now, that didn't convince me that God was calling me to preach, but it did tell me that I did start to feel a sense that God wanted me to do something more, but I didn't know what the more was. So I went and talked to my pastor about it, and I told him, I said, I really feel that God is leading me to do something, but I don't know what it is. And so we looked at several options and ideas, that kind of thing. He sensed that God was calling me into the ministry, but I wasn't sensing that at all. And so he kind of, we talked, we had a great talk about it. I left, I went home, everything was cool. And then there were like three or four other persons in the congregation who were kind of wrestling with this same, like, is God calling me to preach kind of thing. But they were more on the thing of, man, I really think God is calling me to preach. And I was like, nah, I don't know about that. And so what ended up happening was, maybe a couple months later, one of the old school preachers, right, came to the church and preached. And then they pulled all of us into this room, into my pastor's office, his study actually, and the old school preacher, listen, this cat start going hard in the paint. And he's in there twisting them screws, right? Like the God and they call you and they don't miss your calling, and this is the destiny of your life. And he's in there turning them screws, right? And I'm in there holding it together, right? And I'm paying attention. I'm holding it together. And the other 3 or 4 people in the room, they in there losing it. And so tears start coming, and one by one, all of them is like, okay, I surrender, right? All this stuff. And I'm like, oh no, what am I going to do? So I'm in there, and so because the emotions are riding high. So the emotions are riding high, and then everybody's making decisions. So I made a decision, and I was like, okay, I got to do it, right? But like, think my eyes were the only eyes doing like this the whole time, right? But I made a choice because of the emotions. So then afterwards I go home, right? And I get home and my mom, my dad, they're like, hey, son, how was church? And then I just started crying. And so my dad was like, boy, what are you crying for? And I said, to my father, I was like, because I told the pastor that I was going to preach, and I told him that God called me to preach. And so my father says, well, why are you crying? And I said, because I don't know if he actually called me to preach. And so my father said, well, just tell him you can't do it. Yeah. Listen, what did my dad do? My dad reached into my emotion and pulled me out of it and pulled me back to sanity. And my dad said, well, just tell him you can't do it. And so I felt better. Tears were gone. Right? And so the next Sunday I went back to church and I walked up to the pastor and I said, Pastor, I'm not going to do it. Right? Just nice and bold. I'm not going to do it. And he was like, okay, well, what happened? I said, I'm not sure. And he said, okay, no problem. Right? Because my pastor was real cool. And so the other ones, they went, you know, they dived in head first. And so they in there, they on the pulpit now and doing prayers and reading scriptures and, you know, all this kind of thing. And I'm sitting in the congregation and I'm watching them. Right? And every time we get into a conversation, they always trying to pull me in. And I'm like, I don't know. Right? Because I'm on, my dad said, just tell him you can't do it. Right? So, and when my dad did that, and I need you to hear me, when my dad did that, he pulled me out of my emotion, pulled me back to sanity. And what it did for me was it allowed me to stop taking on the emotionality that everybody else was trying to put on me and discover what God wanted for me personally. So what ended up happening was it took 1 year, right? An entire year for God, through conversations, through events, through happenings, through confirmations, through talking to God, God answering the prayer. It took a year for God to get me to the point where I would say, okay, yes, I believe he's called me to do it. And I remember the Sunday I walked into the church, and right after my pastor preached, I walked right up to him, right as he was standing at the altar, you know, greeting people. And I kind of stood in line. And when he got to me, I looked down at him. I said, Pastor, I'm ready. I believe God has called me to the ministry. I'm ready to go. And he looked at me with his eyes and took me in the back, and we had a conversation and all that kind of thing. Now watch this. Within the course of a year after I accepted my calling into the ministry, within the course of a year, the other 3 or 4 people who had accepted their calling on an emotional high, none of them were in ministry by that time. And I remember asking my pastor about it. And I asked him years after that. And I said, remember so-and-so, remember so-and-so, remember so-and-so? And he was like, yeah. And he says, have you talked to him? And I said, no, I haven't kept in contact with him. And I said, Pastor, what do you think about that? Right? Why do you think that happened that way? And my pastor, I never will forget it. My pastor told me, he said, God will use 4 to get the one he really wanted. Listen to me. I'm standing here as your pastor today, not on some emotional high. I'm not here because I'm not here because I'm trying to fulfill some fantasy. I'm not here just off of being gassed up from some people who told me you sound like a preacher and you need to be a preacher. No. My dad took me out of emotionalism, brought me back to mindfulness, and it took God a year to move me to the place where he wanted me to be. But when I got to the place where God wanted me to be, I was there, and I haven't left since, because we make better choices when we're not gassed up on emotionalism. We make better choices when we're not high off of the emotions of others and the emotions of events and scenarios. So if you don't mind, let me give you a little pastoral advice, right? Let me give you a little pastoral advice. When you are emotionally charged, stop deciding and listen and press pause. When you're about to make a choice, when you're about to make a decision, listen to me carefully. And you're about to make an emotionally charged up decision because everybody else is getting married and you want to get married. Right? Because your biological clock is ticking and your emotions are and your family's asking you, well, when are you going to have a kid? Well, when are you going to get married? Well, when are you going to do this? And you have all of these emotional things that are building. Be careful of making decisions when you are on high emotions, whether they are good or negative, because emotions cloud clear decision making. So when you feel yourself emotionally charged, stop deciding and hit pause. Why? Because the 3 or 4 people who accepted their call to the ministry, who are no longer in ministry now, they have to tell that story as a part of their story. They have to say that they accepted a calling that wasn't if they're going to be honest, they're going to have to say that they accepted a fake calling and because none of them are in ministry anymore. But I don't have to tell that story. I can tell the story that the way that I just told it to you, right? That I stepped back and moved away from emotion, but I made a decision not based on emotion. And when I made a decision not solely based on emotion, it's been one of the best decisions I've ever made. So I want you to think about this. When making decisions, it's wise to take time and consider your story. And given that, there's a story that I want to tell. It's a story that comes out of the Old Testament. A guy by the name of Joseph. Many of you know him. Joseph was the youngest son of a man named Jacob. Jacob was the father of the children of Israel. And so you had Joseph, who was the youngest son of Jacob, and Joseph had 11 older brothers. Now, Joseph was also his father's favorite son. And he was his father's favorite son because he was Joseph's favorite wife's son. And so Jacob had Joseph from his favorite wife, which made Joseph his favorite son. And Jacob favored him over his 11 other brothers. And because Joseph favored him over his 11 other brothers, this caused some issues, some anger, some jealousy from his brothers toward himself. And so the story goes that one day, Jacob sends Joseph out to his brothers, really kind of to spy on them. And he tells Joseph, go out, make sure that they're doing what they're supposed to do. Come back, tell me what's going on. So, and when he does this, mind you, his father, Jacob, had made him this coat, right? We call it coat of many colors. But he made him this, I don't know what it looked like, but it was this stylistic kind of pimp coat that he gave his son Joseph. And Joseph shows up with these brand new duds, right? These threads, right? Going back to the 70s. He shows up with this brand new jacket. And he's spying on his brothers, and they do not like it at all. So they get to the point where they make a decision that they're going to kill this dude. So they throw him in a pit, right? They're going to leave him there. They're going to leave him to die. And then they come up with a different idea. The different idea is they say, well, let's take him and let's not just kill him. Let's benefit off of him. And so what they say is, let's sell him into slavery in Egypt. So they decide to take Joseph, pull him out of the pit, and they sell him to a guy by the name of Potiphar, who is in the army of Egypt, and Joseph goes and works for Potiphar as Potiphar's slave. Now, Potiphar takes Joseph home, and Joseph, Bible says that God gave him favor in the house of Potiphar. And so Joseph was literally, he got to the point where he was in charge of absolutely everything. This brother was running everything in the house. He was doing everything. Potiphar didn't have to worry about anything. And brother Joe was taking care of business. And he was actually living pretty good. He was a slave, but he was living pretty good in Potiphar's house. Then something happened. Watch this. Genesis 39 on your handout says this. So he left in Joseph's care everything he had. With Joseph in charge, he did not concern himself with anything except the food he ate. Now Joseph was well built and handsome. And after a while, his master's wife took notice of Joseph and said, "Come to bed with me." Verse 8. But he refused. Watch this. With me in charge, he told her, my master does not concern himself with anything in the house. Everything he owns, he has entrusted to my care. No one is greater in this house than I am. My master has withheld nothing from me except you, because you are his wife. How then could I do such a wicked thing and sin against God? Listen, listen, listen. Joseph is in the house of Potiphar. Joseph has gained the trust of Potiphar, and Potiphar has put everything into Joseph's care, and he's running the house pretty much. He eats well. He has room and board. He's running everything. He has no problems, even though he's a slave, and even though he's in Egypt, and he's not with his family, and he's not with his father. He is in Egypt as a slave, and yet God has blessed him, and he's at the top of the chain in Potiphar's house. But then something happens. What happens is Potiphar's wife starts eyeing old Joe. And she's like, "Hey, Joe, why don't you come get it?" Right? She just, she ain't pulling no punches. She was like, "Joe, listen, you can get it, sir." And Joe now is confronted with a choice. Listen carefully. Joe now has to make a choice. And the question is, what choice will Joe make? Will Joe walk away from what's being offered? Or will Joe indulge himself in the treats of the mistress of the house? What choice will Joe make? Well, Joe makes a choice, and what I'm going to suggest is that Joe chose the option of no, I'm not going to do it. But what I would suggest is that we pay attention to how Joe came to know. See, Joe, he didn't just come to the word no, N-O. He didn't just come to N-O. Joe got to N-O, right? Because I think we would be foolish to think that it wasn't appealing. Right? It would be foolish to think it wasn't appealing. I mean, the reality is this cat was in the military. He wasn't home a lot of times because he was in service. And so Joe was at home with the mistress. She was hot and heavy for him. And, she probably wasn't going to say nothing. I'm sure she was like, "Come to bed with me." And I'm sure that wasn't the whole conversation. I'm sure she was like, "Listen, ain't nobody need to know. Listen, I got you. Hey, listen, you ain't had nobody yet. You came here as a slave. Matter of fact, I'm your master. Come and do me." You know what I mean? Like, I'm commanding you. I'm sure the conversation went on probably for some time, but Joe, and it might have been enticing to Joe, right? But Joe came to N-O. How did Joe come to N-O? The way that Joe came to N-O, I think, is how we need to come to N-O. I think how Joe came to his decision, how he made his choice, if we examine how he made his choice, it will give us good insight into how we should make choices. So what does Joe do? Watch this. Number one on your handout. In order to properly decide what story to tell, we have to discover what story God has already been telling. You missed it, I give it to you again. If we see our lives as a story, the question is, right, the question for Joe is, what story do you want to tell, Joe? Do you want to tell the story that you hit it and quit it with the mistress of the house? Or do you want to tell the story that you stood your ground and you were a man of decency and integrity? What story do you want to tell, Joe? Right? And Joe had to decide what story he wanted to tell. But the only way he was able to get to the proper answer to make the right choice is what Joe did was he looked back and he discovered what story God had already been telling. And when he discovered what God had already been telling, he simply told another part of the story that God had already been telling. So in other words, this is what Joe said. Watch this. He said this, with me in charge, he told her, my master does not concern himself with anything in the house. Right? Everything he owns, he has entrusted to my care. He's talking about the favor that God has put on his life. And then he says, number 9, no one is greater in this house than I am. My master has withheld nothing from me except you, because you are his wife. In other words, what Joseph is saying is, ma'am, I'm a slave in your house, but ma'am, I am actually over you. I am responsible for you because Potiphar, who is my main boss, put me in charge of everything. And he says in verse 9, no one is greater in this house than I am, which means you, ma'am, are actually under me. And Potiphar put me there, and the favor of God has put me in this position. He says, my master has withheld nothing from me except you, because you are his wife. How then could I do such a wicked thing? Watch what he does. And he says, and sin against God. You missed it. Here's what Potiphar is saying. Potiphar is saying, the story that God has been telling is this story. I will take care of you no matter what circumstance. That's the story God has been telling. God protected Jacob when his brothers wanted to kill him. And instead of killing him, they put him in slavery. When he went into slavery, God protected him and didn't give him a bad master, but a good one. And the master put him in charge of absolutely everything. And so the story that Joseph looked at was the story that God had already been telling about his life. And when he looked at the story God had told, he was like, I'm not about to mess that up. I'm not about to have an asterisk in my story because I simply want some of the goodies that you're trying to offer me. No, God is telling the story of my life. And when I look back over what God has done for me, when I look back over how God has brought me through, when I look back over how God has delivered me, when I look back over how God has helped me, when I look back over the doors God has opened, when I look back over the doors God has closed, when I look back over how God has helped me through situation after situation, time after time, difficulty after difficulty, when I look back over my life and I discover the positions that God has put me in that I don't even deserve, how dare I put an asterisk in the story that God is trying to tell? Listen, Joseph said, no, I'm going to keep that story going. And he decided, I'm not going to do it. Watch this. See, now, many of us, after listening to that, right, we're feeling bad. And I'm going to tell you why. Many of us are feeling bad because at this point, you're thinking, well, what about my life? Right? There are some things I have done. There are some decisions I have made that I can't take back. Right? You're thinking now, I was Joseph, but I chose option A. I didn't choose option B. I chose option A. Some of you are like, listen, I didn't choose what Joseph chose. Right? So Joseph didn't do the dum-dum. He didn't choose to do the dum-dum, but I chose to do the dum-dum. So what about my life, right? What about my story? Right? And so here's what I want to say to you, if that's where you are, because you're feeling bad, because you have made some choices, and then you wondering about your life because Joseph is too high of a figure for you to, associate with, because Joseph turned some stuff down when you turn some stuff on. And so what about you? Here we go. I would say this: all of us kind of need to slow down, pause, and stop for a minute. Right? We all need to stop for a minute. What do you mean stop? I mean stop. And what I mean is stop having, listen carefully, testimony envy. Stop trying to make someone else's story your testimony. You see, many of us are like Joseph, and we have a testimony about the keeping power of God. You see, the reality is some of us have been kept from some things, and we have made choices in the past, and we didn't give ourselves over to some stuff. Some of us, we have not been exposed as other people have been to certain things. Some of us have not had to navigate certain decisions as other people have had to do. But this is, and I need for you to understand this, this is the testimony to the power of God to keep us and his sovereign role in our lives to prevent us from falling into certain things and making certain decisions. You see, it was really our family structure, our character makeup. It was the strategic person in our lives that actually kept us from doing dumb stuff. For me, it was my cousin Cedric. My cousin Cedric was sort of the icon of the family that all of the kids wanted to be like, including myself. And Cedric had certain standards and rules of what it meant to be cool if you were going to hang around with him. And so for me, like Cedric was super anti-drinking and he was super anti-smoking. And so for me, right, listen, I've never been drunk before. Not ever, not once. I've never been tipsy. I don't even know what that feels like. Listen, I've never smoked a cigarette, never smoked a joint. I've been around people who do it. I've been around people who do all of it. I've never done any drugs other than some Tylenol and some Motrin and whatever. But no hard drugs, no alcohol, no weed, no nothing. And to that, some of you go, oh, good. Oh, here we go, right? Now you bragging. No, I'm not bragging. What I'm saying is, listen carefully. Just because that's my testimony doesn't mean that you have to try to make my testimony your testimony. Or just because my testimony is what it is, it doesn't mean that your testimony is worth any less because you actually did some stuff. You see, the reality is this: our testimony, my testimony, and people like me, there are people like me who have testimonies, and our testimonies are about the keeping power of God, where God has kept us out of some stuff. But then there are people like many of you who are listening, and the reality is that's not your testimony. Your testimony is not about the keeping power of God, because the reality is God didn't keep you out of some stuff. Right? He did not. God allowed you to make decisions and to go head first into a whole lot of stuff. And so your testimony is not about the keeping power of God. Your testimony is about the delivering power of God. So I don't have a delivering power of God testimony. I have a keeping power God testimony, but you have a delivering power of God testimony. And so it was that God didn't keep you from some things, but he delivered you from some things. God didn't keep you out, he brought you out. My testimony is that God kept me from many chains of bondage, but your testimony is God broke your chains of bondage. And the reality is that in the end, all of us are the same. We are free, we are blessed, we are grateful, we are humbled, and we are thankful for God's power in our lives, whether it was to keep us or whether it was to deliver us. Right? And for many of us who have the power or the testimony of God's keeping power, we have the problem often of forgetting our testimony. Because, and I've watched this in church, I've watched how many of us, we think that our testimonies aren't as powerful because we don't have the big testimony. We don't have the big testimony of God delivering us from a crack house, or God bringing us out of prostitution, or God delivering us out of some prison. Right? And we think that other people's testimonies are greater than ours because they have these big testimonies of all the stuff that God delivered them from, but we don't have those great testimonies. Listen to me. Your testimony, if you have a testimony of his keeping power, is no less powerful than somebody's testimony of how God brought them out of crack cocaine, because the same power that brings somebody out of crack cocaine is the same power that God used to prevent you from smoking crack. And so your power to stay out of some stuff is the same power God used to pull people out of some stuff. Either way, it's about his power. So Joseph said no. But then watch this. Tell you what happened. Potiphar's wife didn't like the no. So she came to Joe and she said, I'm going to fix you. So what she did was she lied. And when Potiphar came home, she said, Joe tried to rape me. She pulled Joe to herself and got into a little tussle with him. And Joe was trying to get away from her. And Potiphar walks in and she says, he tried to rape me. And Potiphar, disappointed with Joseph and taking the word of his wife, has Potiphar sent to prison. Potiphar ends up in the prison, and while he's there in the prison, two people from Pharaoh's court show up. The baker and the cupbearer. The baker and the cupbearer show up, and they are saddened because they've both had dreams that they don't know how to interpret. Joseph, who was actually in the prison, and God gave Joseph favor in the prison to the extent that the prison warden put Joe in charge of the whole prison. And so he notices the cupbearer and the baker in the prison. And on your handout, it says this: when Joseph came to them the next morning, he saw that they were dejected. So he asked Pharaoh's officials who were in custody with him in his master's house, why are your faces so sad today? We both had dreams, they answered, but there is no one to interpret them. Then Joseph said to them, do not interpretations belong to God? Tell me your dreams. So they tell Joe the dreams. And as they tell Joe the dreams, Joe interprets all of the dreams. And he tells the cupbearer that Pharaoh will restore him back to the house of Pharaoh. But then he tells the baker that Pharaoh is actually going to have him beheaded. And then this is what Joe says to the cupbearer. He says in Genesis 40, verse 14, he says, but when all goes well with you, remember me and show me kindness. Mention me to Pharaoh and get me out of this prison. For I was forcibly carried off from the land of the Hebrews, and even here I have done nothing to deserve being put in a dungeon. Then we learn in Genesis 40, verse 23, says these words: the chief cupbearer, however, did not remember Joseph. He forgot him. Wow. So what do you have? You have Joe, who gets sent into slavery. He has to make a choice, and he makes the right choice. And even though he makes the right choice, he ends up in prison. Number 2 on your handout. Making the right choice will not always get you where you want to go. Let that one sink in. You see, this whole series is about choices, and what I'm telling you is that if you make the right choices, you will have better outcomes. But what I'm also sharing with you is this, is that sometimes making the right choice will not always get you where you want to go. Sometimes making the right choice will land you in more trouble. And some of you know exactly what I'm talking about. Some of you have experienced that sometimes when you make the right choice, sometimes the right choice will land you in far more trouble than you anticipated. And then we learned this in Genesis chapter 41, verse 1. It says this: when 2 full years passed, and don't let that pass you by. This brother is in prison on some stuff he didn't even do after making the right choice. And after making the right choice, he's in prison, and then he does something good. He makes another right choice. He interprets the dreams properly and gives them to the people. And then he simply asks for the fella that he interpreted the dream to that not to forget him. But then the fella forgets him, and he forgets him for 2 years. And so Joe was in prison for 2 years. And then it says when 2 full years had passed, Pharaoh had a dream. So Pharaoh had this dream that he couldn't shake. He had 2 of them, actually. One about stalks of wheat or corn, and the other about cows. And he couldn't interpret the dreams. And he called all of the people from Egypt, right? All of the soothsayers and the magicians and all that. And nobody could interpret the dream. And then the cupbearer said, man, I messed up. And he goes to Pharaoh and he says, when I was in prison, remember when you were angry with me? Remember that? And you put me in prison? He says, man, I had a dream too. And there was this dude in prison who interpreted my dream and the baker's dream. And he told us exactly what was going to happen. And it happened exactly the way he said. And so Pharaoh was like, who is this fella? And he said, man, this is this cat Joe down in the jail. And so Pharaoh calls for Joe, and Joe comes up to see Pharaoh, and the Bible says, verse 15 of chapter 41, Pharaoh said to Joseph, I had a dream and no one can interpret it, but I have heard it said of you that when you hear a dream, you can interpret it. Verse 16, I cannot do it, Joseph replied to Pharaoh, but God will give Pharaoh the answer he desires. Verse 25, then Joseph said to Pharaoh, the dreams of Pharaoh are one and the same. God has revealed to Pharaoh what he is about to do. Now, you gotta catch, there's a little nuance going here that you gotta catch, right? Because in this day and time, Pharaoh felt that he was a god. But when Joe is talking to Pharaoh, Joe says to Pharaoh, right? He says in verse 16, I cannot do it. Right? Joseph replied to Pharaoh, but God will give Pharaoh the answer he desires. So what Joseph does is Joseph says, I can get you the interpretation of the dream, but you've got to recognize the real God because it's not you. And then Joe comes back in verse 25 and Joe says, then Joseph said to Pharaoh, the dreams of Pharaoh are one and the same. God, the real one, revealed to Pharaoh, who is not the real God. God revealed to Pharaoh what he is about to do. Right? Then Joseph does something interesting. Joseph says in verse 32, the reason the dream was given to Pharaoh in 2 forms is that the matter has been firmly decided by God, and God will do it soon. In other words, what Joseph is doing is he's introducing Pharaoh to God by interpreting his dreams for him. And then in verse 33, watch this. Now let Pharaoh look for a discerning and wise man and put him in charge of the land of Egypt. Let Pharaoh appoint commissioners over the land to take 1/5 of the harvest of Egypt during the 7 years of abundance. They should collect all the food of these good years that are coming and store up the grain under the authority of Pharaoh to be kept in the cities for food. This food should be held in reserve for the country to be used during the 7 years of famine that will come upon Egypt, so that the country may not be ruined by the famine. Verse 37, the plan seemed good to Pharaoh and to all his officials. This is groundbreaking. Why? Because not only did Joseph interpret the dream, but Joseph also starts giving advice as to how Egypt should run. So here you have a prisoner telling Pharaoh how he should run his city. And so, verse 38, so Pharaoh asked him, can we find anyone like this man? One in whom is the Spirit of God, right? Now Pharaoh is talking the God talk. Then Pharaoh said to Joseph, since God has made all this known to you, there is no one so discerning and wise as you. You shall be in charge of my palace, and all my people are to submit to your orders. Only with respect to the throne will I be greater than you. So Pharaoh said to Joseph, I hereby put you in charge of the whole land of Egypt. Then Pharaoh took his signet ring from his finger and put it on Joseph's finger. He dressed him in robes of fine linen and put a gold chain around his neck. He had him ride in a chariot as the second in command, and men shouted before him, make way. Thus he put him in charge of the whole land of Egypt. Then Pharaoh said to Joseph, I am Pharaoh, but without your word, no one will lift hand or foot in all Egypt. Wow. You talk about from the pig pen to the palace, right? So you talk about your gift making room for you. So here you have Joseph who interprets the dream of Pharaoh, and in the matter of minutes, Joseph is brought out of the prison, put into the palace. Pharaoh puts on him new clothes and then puts him in charge of everything and makes him the second most powerful man in Egypt straight from the prison. Right? Watch this. Remember, I told you, making the right choice will not always get you where you want to go. And that's true. And then I said, sometimes making the right choice will land you in more trouble. And that's true. Number 3. However, making the right choices when in trouble will get you where you want to go. See, this is not about doing the right thing one time. This is not about making the right choice once. This is not about choosing the right thing one time. Right? This is not about eating the right food one day. No. This is not about exercising one time. No. This, and I've dealt with people over the years where they have come to me with an issue or a problem or a difficulty, and they're like, Pastor, I don't know what to do. And then I tell them what to do, and then they go do it, and then they come back and they say, that didn't work. Yes, it did. Right? But they're saying it didn't work because it didn't make things better. And what I'm trying to tell you is that sometimes doing the right thing will put you it will not take you where you want to go immediately. But when you keep doing the right thing, even when you do the right thing and it has negative consequences, if you do the right thing in the negative consequences, one day God is going to show up inside of your right choices in the negative consequences, just like he did for Joseph, and God will bring you out just like he did Joseph, because it's not about doing the right thing once, it's about doing the right thing consistently. Back to last week, we looked at Galatians chapter 6. Do not be deceived. God cannot be mocked. A man reaps what he sows. Remember, we talked about that. And so there are laws of sowing and reaping, 3 of which I want to point out. Number 1, what you sow, you reap. Number 2, you don't reap, listen carefully, in the same season in which you sow. So if there is a plant time and there is a harvest time. And so there are times when we do the right thing, but the right thing, you won't see the results of it until a later season. And so the key is to keep doing the right thing even when you don't see results, because results are coming, because you don't reap in the same season in which you sow. And then you always reap greater than what you sow, which is why it's important to do the right thing consistently. It's important to make right choices consistently. Because, see, watch this. Joseph sowed faithfulness and reaped a vice presidency. Joseph sowed holiness and reaped the saving of his entire family. Joseph sowed integrity and reaped the control of a country. Joseph sowed faith and reaped the favor of God on everything he did in his life. And the question is, what story do you want to tell? Because the story that Joseph was able to tell was, I was faithful as a slave. I was faithful as a prisoner. And because I was faithful as a slave and faithful as a prisoner, God saw fit to pull me out of my prison and to put me in the palace and to put me in charge of everything. And then watch this, and we going home on this one. Genesis 45, 1 through 8. Then Joseph could no longer control himself before all his attendants, and he cried out, right? And this is where he's already in charge. The famine is taking place, and his brothers, 2 years into the famine, show up, right, to buy grain from Egypt, because Egypt has all of the grain because of Joseph's plan. So his brothers show up, and they don't know that they are dealing with Joseph. Joseph knows them, but they don't know it's him. But watch what happens. Then Joseph could no longer control himself before his attendants, and he cried out, have everyone leave my presence. So there was no one with Joseph when he made himself known to his brothers. And he wept so loudly that the Egyptians heard him, and Pharaoh's household heard about it. Verse 3, Joseph said to his brothers, I am Joseph. Is my father still living? But his brothers were not able to answer him because they were terrified at his presence. Listen, these cats were scared because they thought they had got rid of Joseph, only to find out that God had raised Joseph up. And Joseph was now before them as the second most powerful person in Egypt. And Joe remembers what they did to him, and they remember what they did to him. Watch this, verse 4. Then Joseph said to his brothers, come close to me. Come here. Right? Then he says, when they had done so, he said, I am your brother Joseph, the one you sold into Egypt. Listen. Here's what he doesn't do. Joseph doesn't spiritualize what happened. He's honest and said, I'm the one you sold into Egypt. Verse 5, and do not be distressed and do not be angry with yourselves for selling me here. So he tells them again, yes, you sold me here, because it was to save lives that God sent me ahead of you. Wait a minute. Hold on. Watch this. Keep reading. Verse 6. For 2 years now, there has been a famine in the land, and for the next 5 years, there will not be any plowing or reaping. But God sent me ahead of you to preserve for you a remnant on earth and to save your lives by a great deliverance. So then, it was not you who sent me here, but God. He made me father to Pharaoh, lord of his entire household, the ruler of all Egypt. Wow. Listen, what is Joe saying? Joe says this. Joe says, I'm not going to spiritualize or over spiritualize what happened. Joe says, you guys, you sold me as a slave to Egypt. And he confronts it. He says it. He doesn't say it didn't happen. He says, you sold me as a slave to Egypt. He says, you sold me here. He says it in verse 4 and he says it in verse 5. But what Joseph does is he graduates, he elevates his whole, he elevates it to a larger story. He makes the story he makes the story of his enslavement and his selling into a larger story about the deliverance that God wants to do. And so Joseph says, you guys sold me, but God sent me. Oh, you missed it. He says, you sold me, but God sent me. You pushed me, but God was behind me. You did it, but God used it. Listen, number 4, we have to learn how to elevate the view of our life past the moments of life. Because if we cannot see our lives as being in the hand of God, where God is sovereign in all things, good and bad, we will be miserable and continue to make wrong choices because we see our lives as a series of events rather than a story that is being written about the power, will, and glory of God. If not, listen, and if not, we will only see our lives as a series of events rather than a story being written one choice at a time. And so the question is, whenever you're facing a situation, whenever you're facing a challenge, whenever you're facing a decision, you have to ask, what is the story that I want to tell? What is the story that I want to be told about me? What's the story? Because one day, all of the events in your life are going to transform themselves into a story. And the question is, what story do I want to tell? What story do I want told? What story do I want my kids to know? What story do I want to tell my children? What story do I want told to my family? What story do I want told to my wife? What story? What is the story that you want told? I bet you if Bill Cosby did everything people say he did, and he could have looked at his life then from the way he is portrayed now, he might have made different decisions because he wouldn't want this story to be told this way. What story do you want to tell? All of us want to be the hero. Don't just tell the story about being the hero. Be the hero. Make the choice that makes you the hero of your story. But I've made so many choices and my story is already jacked up. Your story up to this chapter is jacked up. But you can make new choices moving forward and write new chapters. Because let me tell you something about a story. The story at the end erases and properly contextualizes the story in the beginning. Back to Bill Cosby. Everything he's done positive is being reframed in the story that's now being told. And there are some people whose beginning story was terrible, but their ending story is wonderful. And when you look at their end story, you almost forget about their beginning story because the end of their story is so much greater. What's the story you want to tell? Father in heaven, we thank you for all that you have said and all that we have heard today. I pray and ask, Lord, that you would touch the minds and hearts of everyone listening. I pray, Lord, that you would put it in our hearts and minds that we would be careful and pay attention to the story that we want told and make decisions based on the story we want to be told. I pray, Lord, for everyone listening that we would dive back into our lives and we would discover the story that you're already trying to tell. And when it comes to us making decisions and furthering our own stories, that we would make decisions in line with the story that you're trying to tell. God, I ask that you would do it all. In Jesus' mighty name, amen. Listen, everybody, thank you for tuning in. Hope and pray that this message has blessed you in some kind of way. Listen, the legacy question: what will be your legacy? What story do you want to tell? And I will see you next week for the next question in our series, Choices. God bless you. Bye-bye.